such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is about a spoiled son who killed his millionaire parents. Family murders are often the hardest to comprehend, especially when it's one of their own that's named a killer. But from 200 miles away, how could the only survivor be involved? Especially when he was hanging out with the FBI at the time his mother, father, and sister were killed. I also want to thank Established Titles, a sponsor who allows me to continue making these videos. This is actually an adorable project where you can become royalty or a lord or a lady, or you can allow someone in your life to become one. This occurs because of a historic Scottish custom where if you just buy 1 square foot of land, you are granted a lord or a lady title, and you can officially be royalty. Well, kind of, without the castle, but with a suffix of either lord or lady that can be added to even credit cards and plane tickets and much more. Even more incredibly, this brand helps with reforestation. They actually plant a tree with every single order, and they work with different charities like Trees for the Future to help the planet. There are also couple packs where you can get adjoining plots of land for you and your loved one and be lord and lady, or lord and lord, or lady and lady right next to each other. You will then receive a certificate with an actual crest and exact location of your plot, which you can look online at a map, or you can visit yourself if you want to. I got my dad one, and he is the least fancy, most humble man in the universe, and he thought this was hilarious and is going to go show all of his work buddies immediately. Now, Established Titles is running a big sale right now, and for an extra 10% off, you can use the code Brooke10 or go to establishedtitles.com/Brooke10 to get your gifts now. Thank you guys for supporting sponsors. It truly helps me to continue working on these videos and to know that the sponsors that I put out are being supported. Now let's get back to the story. It was 1992 in California, and the Ewell family lived in Fresno. Now, this was 59-year-old Dale and his wife, 57-year-old Glee, and their 2 children, who were 24-year-old Tiffany Ann and 21-year-old Dana. Now, the Ewell family was not a struggling kind of family. Dale and Glee had worked hard their entire lives, but no one really knew how luxurious they could have been living. Dale had grown up in a farming family, and so he knew what it meant to work really hard. It was also during the Great Depression, and by the time he was an adult, he was actually serving in the United States Air Force, and then he started a business called the Western Piper Sales, selling small aircrafts. This business was making him millions, and he also ran several farms in the area. But he would meet his future wife, Glee, while he was stationed in Phoenix. She was an heiress to a wealthy family who made money from oil. But she worked as well. She worked very hard, and she was actually a Spanish translator for the CIA and was devoted to philanthropy. She was actually one that had a seat on the State Bar Committee, which evaluated judges as well. So both Dale and Glee were very powerful people in their own way. So when the couple got together, they had these 2 children, and Glee became a homemaker at this time. They had Tiffany, and 4 years later, they would have Dana. They were given everything they could want as children. I mean, they had constant support from their mother, they had advice from their father, and they really tried to give them a normal upbringing, but they weren't lacking in any way. While Dale's businesses were successful, he also was said to invest in the stock market, and they were estimated to have what would be now $12 to $14 million. But they kept a very humble home and lifestyle, and nobody really knew how rich they were. Yet for their kids, they did have a little more spending room. They wanted to give them everything they didn't have when they grew up. And especially Dale, who had grown up more poor. He wanted to make sure his children were going to be successful in the future, and he believed that it would help them to give them a little in the beginning. As the kids got older and they had graduated high school, they didn't have to worry about paying for college like many do. Tiffany was actually a graduate student at this point, and Dana was getting a finance degree at college, and he was said to be a senior at this time, and afterwards he was going to be an investment banker. Dale and Glee continued to provide them stability all through their 20s, and they had the money to do so they decided that they weren't going to cut them off just yet. They were going to help them start out with their lives, and the two, when they weren't in college, were also living at home. Unlike most young adults, Tiffany and Dana were thriving. They didn't have a care in the world. They were given spending money. They were driving these really fancy brand new cars. They were wearing designer clothes, and some would say they were spoiled, but others would say that they were lucky. However, on Easter weekend, the Ewell family decided to go to their beach house to celebrate. Now, this was in Perro Dunes, around 2.5 hours from their home in Fresno. And that Sunday, April 19th, they all played tennis. They were, goofing around. They were eating lunch together, and they took a walk on the beach before they decided to head home to prepare for the work week. Now, 2 days later, no one from this family had gone to school, had gone back to work, and on April 21st, their bodies would be discovered. Investigators found inside the home that Glee was in the den, and she had been shot 4 times, and her arm was also above her head, shielding her eyes. Now, Tiffany was in the kitchen, and she had been shot once, and Dale was shot as well, but it was from behind as he walked into the home. However, Dana was not inside. He had survived, and he was technically the one to help find the bodies because he had been away that weekend. He had gone to Easter Sunday, that lunch with his family, but he had also been with the FBI. You see, he had a girlfriend named Monica, whose father was an FBI agent, and they had all gotten together for Easter weekend to celebrate, and Dana wasn't going to be going home with his family because they were going to go back to school that Monday, so he stayed with his girlfriend when his parents went home. He did try to call his family to make sure that they made it home, and when no one answered, he actually called one of the neighbors to ask them to go check, and it took them those 2 days to actually go and do something about it, and that is when they came across the housekeeper that was getting ready to go in around 9 a.m. When she opened the door, the alarm didn't sound, and it was oddly quiet. Now, investigators found that the Ewell family hadn't gotten home together. Dana, of course, wasn't there, but Dale had actually flown one of his aircrafts to the beach house and back, and Tiffany and Glee had driven there and back home, just the two of them. Dale was one who was actually very afraid of all the family members being together and them all being killed, and so he often liked to separate. Little did he know his greatest fear was about to come true in a way that he couldn't have ever predicted. You see, the girls arrived first, and then Dale arrived around 30 minutes later, but from where they were placed, it didn't appear that Dale even noticed that his wife and daughter had been killed before he was. He didn't get the chance to. Investigators were looking around, and they did believe this was a burglary gone wrong. The home had been ransacked, but there was no sign of forced entry. The Fresno County homicide detectives couldn't find any fingerprints nor shell casings, but a box of unused shells for a 9mm was found in Dale's nightstand that was missing a few of them. They then located a bullet hole that had gone into the home rather than into one of the victims, and this was the only one that missed, leading them to believe that this killer was a professional. The autopsies revealed that a 9mm assault rifle as well as a homemade silencer was used on the family. Looking closer at the scene, though, Detective John Souza said he believed the ransacked home was not a burglary, but a staged burglary. And if this was true, then the killer had simply been hiding in this home, waiting for the Ewells to come home. And the question was why? Well, the Fresno community had many opinions. Some in the neighborhood had heard this weird clanking sound and had no idea what it was. Some of the members of the community knew about Glee's past work with the CIA and wondered if this had something to do with it, if it was something she had done or didn't do that caused her death, especially as she was the one who was riddled with bullets the most, her being shot 4 times where the others were just shot once. When looking into this, investigators found that while working with the CIA, she had been stationed in Argentina to be that Spanish translator for them, and this was a few years before she met Dale. But the other theory among the public had to do with drug smuggling. Many believed that Dale was really in a business that covered up the fact that he was a drug smuggler using his airplanes to get the drugs into Mexico. And this theory wasn't entirely false. You see, before owning his own business, Dale had worked for a man named Frank Lambie, who had also sold airplanes. This was about 20 years prior, and Frank had actually been convicted of drug smuggling with his airplanes where Dale was working. Now, when Frank went to prison, Dale actually took over his business, which became his own. Many believed that that wasn't all he took over, and that's why the family was so wealthy. Now, what they didn't know was that investigators were actually looking into this angle. It wasn't too far-fetched. They believed that bad blood could have existed between Dale and Frank and continued even then that would have led to a murder, although Frank was in prison still at this time. While investigators cordoned off the home for the next 4 days searching for any small piece of evidence, they were not talking to the public, which made many stories emerge. One being that the bodies inside were actually mutilated and that this had been done by the Filipino mob. They didn't realize that it was more likely that this was done by someone close to the family. In fact, investigators were deep into their own suspect. They had found that Dale and his brother Ben had actually been in this real estate golf course development deal that had gone south. It was going to cost the investors millions in losses, and those investors were Filipinos. But that wasn't the only business deal that was a bit shady when coming from Dale. When they were looking into his records, his business deals were less than ethical. You see, investigators found zero proof of the drug smuggling money, but they did find that often the sale prices of the planes would be vastly different from sale to sale. One was even an extra $2,500 that Dale had just pocketed. His employees also said that they didn't really love him and that he could be extremely money focused. It was turning out that the Ewells may have had more enemies than expected, and one by one the suspects were looked into and then they fell off the list. Investigators then had ruled out drug smuggling and being the motive for this murder, whether it be that Dale was involved in it now or from the past when Frank was. But more importantly, they were certain that Dale had no reason to have drugs be a part of his business, and he had no new clients. His business was clean. However, he did have business clients as well as real estate investors who could have had a problem with him, and the Filipinos were an easy suspect to hone in on. Investigators wanted to say that this was an easy motive because they would have been losing millions. Yet Dale and Ben were both in on this deal, and Ben was fine. So it didn't make sense as to why Ben would be okay, and yet Tiffany and Glee were murdered. While every possible suspect was questioned, watched, their past exposed, there was one person that no one could lay to rest, and that was the one person who had the perfect alibi. You see, Dana Ewell was 200 miles away that night, but no one was surprised when his name continued to come up in gossip as a possible suspect. The only problem was proving how he could have been in 2 places at once. One location with this FBI agent, and the other location where his entire family was murdered. It wasn't just because this was a crazier story that this son had killed his mother, father, and sister, but also that there were millions of reasons why. Not to mention millions of dollars. His own family was immediately pointing at him, especially his grandfather. They even got attorneys involved to make sure that Dana was not going to collect his inheritance. It turned out that Dana had been talking about how he wanted to be a multimillionaire by the time he was 25, and he was 21 at that point, so he had 4 years left, but he was still living at home, fully being supported by his parents. He didn't have a job, he was still in college, he wasn't working towards anything. But his friends and his girlfriends knew him to be this extremely wealthy and financially successful, independent man. He would spend so much money on everyone. His girlfriend would get these super expensive gifts. Dana was paying for her college tuition to go to law school, and he told everyone that he had his own airplane transport business, as well as being a stock market whiz. Sound familiar? Well, that's because everything that Dana said he was actually his father's success. He actually told this to a news reporter who printed this story to the whole community, and his family saw this and were so confused. But they also knew that Dana was a liar. And this was something that he had proved time and time again. And after the murders, the spending didn't stop. In fact, it got worse. Those who knew Dana even growing up said he was obsessed with money and being this self-made man, except what he was really known as was being a pathological liar. Everything that came out of his mouth was not to be trusted by those who actually knew him. It could be the simplest little question, and he would twist this into this entire story that was nothing close to the truth. He lied about where he was born, traumas he had, that he was abused, and all about his childhood. He could not be trusted, and he didn't seem to care that everybody knew these were fake stories. Even back in high school, he would hand out $100 bills to everyone to think that he was so rich he could do that, and he was voted most likely to succeed, so they believed him. His family would always get word of the different lies that he was spewing, and no matter how much they talked to him about it, he would not stop. They were a very private family, and they just wanted him to be honest and to not spread lies, and he could not do that. Most of the time, if wrongdoing was done by him, it was actually covered up by Dale. This even involved a car accident that Dale claimed was actually his wrongdoing and not Dana's. But they were quickly finding out they could no longer cover up all of his lies. Now, although Dana didn't have the best reputation, he had given $25,000 of the $50,000 reward fund for information on his family's murders, and when he heard about it, he immediately flew to Fresno to talk to detectives. Investigators had asked him who he thought could have done this, and he told them that the family had noticed that everyone on the block were quacks, and that their kids were turning out to be monsters. One of the detectives then walked him through the crime scene, and they said they immediately knew he was dirty at that point because all he cared about was cleaning up the crime scene after seeing the blood of his family on the walls of his home. The remaining Ewell family members said that all he wanted to talk about after the murder was his parents' wills. And still, even after all of this, they had no proof that he murdered anyone, and he was 200 miles away. His girlfriend Monica and her family backed his alibi wholeheartedly. He had been there the whole time. So if he didn't do this, they knew it couldn't have been done by his own hands. So their next question was, did he hire someone? Bank account statements were collected in hopes that a large amount of money had been transferred out that day, but it's never that easy, and so they had to rummage through Dana's 47 bank accounts, and instead they found that Dana had been giving money to himself, transferring it from his grandmother's bank account. This was for the last 3 years, where he had taken $400,000 from his own grandmother, who is 93 years old, and was left with $2,000 to pay for her care. She had no idea this was happening and that she was completely out of money. But there was also a confession of evil that had been found within pages of a letter to a college professor. You see, in college, Dana had plagiarized another student's paper, turned it in, the professor found out about it, and gave him an F. And so Dana then wrote him a 6-page letter, which apologized for the plagiarism, but it also said that he had very strange thoughts about serial killers and what psychologically stressed people do, and that he didn't want to do anything wrong. Strangely enough, his grandfather, who was the first person to point the finger at Dana, died 2 years later in a basement explosion at his own home in Ohio. This was while the murder investigation was still ongoing. It was said to be an unsafe gas generator, but some people did not believe this. At this point, though, the gun used for the murders was found to be a specialty gun. It was manufactured by Feather Industries in Trinidad, Colorado, and when the company records were seized, a man's name popped out, and this was Ernest Jack Ponce. Now, Ernest claimed that he had bought the rifle for a friend, and this was the Radoviches. Ernest said he had no idea that a crime was going to be taking place with this gun, but this was their first big break, because one of Dana's friends was named Joel Radovich. He had quite a mysterious disappearance as well, because not long after the murders, he had been briefly questioned, and he said that himself and Dana were not very close. He had an alibi to get him released, and then after that, he dropped out of school and he vanished. They found this out because they realized his alibi could not be corroborated, and they went to look for him again, and he was gone. See, it turned out that Dana and Joel actually were very close. They had met in college at Santa Clara University, and Dana was more of this extrovert, and Joel was intrigued by him and how he talked to girls and his businessman tendencies. And so Joel, as more of this introvert who stayed home, played video games, and never really dated, clung on to this extrovert for help in the social department. He definitely did not know what to do with his life. Joel appeared to have everything together, and they were inseparable, even going all the way to when the murders occurred. After the murders, though, investigators were watching Dana, and it wasn't long before they found Joel too, due to their contact. However, they weren't going to immediately arrest him because they believed they could get further evidence if they just waited. Ernest, the man who had bought the gun originally, did start talking at this point, and he said that Joel had also asked him about a lockpicking kit, but the most damning evidence was that Ernest said he helped Joel dispose of a gun that was believed to be a murder weapon. Except when investigators asked him to take a lie detector test, he refused, but he did let them record a call between himself and Joel. After this, investigators went to Dana's dorm, and he opened the door, and they told him they believed that they had a prime suspect as his family's killer. And he said absolutely nothing, as they told him it was his friend Joel, but his face did drain of color. Once they left, the investigators, Dana and his girlfriend Monica, ran to the nearby payphone and called who they later found out to be Joel. Investigators knew at this point that Joel and Dana had been using pagers as well as payphones to talk and avoid being heard. But after months of figuring out what was going on, a detective wearing a wire actually stood next to Joel at the payphone to catch some of their conversation. Joel didn't notice him at all, and that's when they caught Joel saying, "They don't have the evidence. They will try to catch you in a lie." They would also refer to the murders as that 3-shirt deal. Dana then moved into the family home and would have friends over after not cleaning up the crime scene at all. He told a friend who then told detectives that they would never solve the case because they were a bunch of dummies. He then invited Joel to come and live with him, which Joel did. They were going to a lot of different bank accounts together from investigator surveillance, and they were taking a lot of cash out of the accounts. Most was going to Joel. Then investigators found that a year prior to the murder, Joel was found to buy books on making a homemade silencer as well as how to be a hitman. The story then began to come together. Joel had entered the Ewell family home with a backpack, a pager, a purple tarp, a 9mm assault rifle, and a homemade silencer at dawn. That Sunday, that Easter morning. He laid down the tarp. He sat down with several layers of latex gloves on, completely hairless. He was shaved from head to toe, not one strand of hair on him. And he refused to go to the bathroom either. He wasn't going to leave anything behind, especially DNA. And after the murders were done, he then tried to feel the Ewell family's pulses, but he did this on their forearm, and so it wasn't working. And then he disassembled the guns, put it in his backpack, and took off his gloves. He believed that he accidentally left one there, which was the only thing that went wrong. He then waited until it was dark outside to leave, and this meant that Dana had hired his own friend to kill his entire family. It turned out that Dana's constant lies to his father, Dale, had Dale telling him that once he graduated that summer, he was going to be cut off from everything. The finances were going to be gone, and he would have to make it on his own, and this was believed to be the ultimate motive of a self-made liar, a millionaire fraud, a son who was about to lose everything that he was, or that he seemed to be. Now that his family was gone, he was going to be getting $8 million. or so he thought. It turned out that even if he hadn't been a suspect from their murders, his parents had put a trust fund in place, meaning he wouldn't even get that money until he was in his 30s. When he heard this, which was right after the murders, he did not care who was around. He was furious. He slammed his hands down on the table, asking why his father would do this to him. But it took 3 years after the murders for the killers to finally be arrested in March of 1995. This was Dana Ewell, Joel Radovich, his brother Peter, and Ernest Ponce. Then it was time for trial. However, Peter and Ernest weren't going to be going to trial due to the immunity that they had been given because they were going to testify against Dana and Joel. Joel and Dana were being represented by 2 completely different attorneys, and Dana's claimed that he was completely innocent, but Joel's was simply saying that he should not get the death penalty. Prosecutors claimed that Dana had promised Joel part of the inheritance that he would receive. Now, Detective Chris Curtis said that Glee Ewell had been straddled and shot at close range that day, meaning that she saw her killer. And knowing that it was Joel, she knew in that moment that her own son was killing her. Ernest testified that he had bought the gun with the money that Joel gave him, thinking that Joel was just going to resell it. But the day the bodies were found, Joel had come to him panicking, saying he didn't know what he did wrong, and that is when they disposed of the weapon. He had told Ernest that it had to do with $8 million, and they were going to assume the throne. Ernest said that Peter, Joel's brother, was also there when they disassembled all the guns, the empty shell casings, and his shoes, and buried them all over. Joel was then said to keep coming to Ernest's job and offering him money because he felt bad. He felt like he was going to say something, and he only took the money so Joel would leave. Peter, Joel's brother, testified that he knew Ernest in high school and they would go to the shooting range together sometimes, and he knew that his brother Joel had asked Ernest for a gun 2 to 4 months before the murders. Peter claimed that Easter Sunday morning, Joel was at his apartment around 11 a.m. because he was watching their dog for them. He said that he left around 12 to 1 and he didn't come home until 9 to 11 that night and appeared very calm. Joel had mentioned something to Peter about seeing his face on America's Most Wanted and that he needed to get out of town, but Peter didn't really understand. But when they went to bury everything, Joel had told both Peter and Ernest what he had done. And he also said, "If there's a God, I'm effed." Now, this is when one of Dana's friends since kindergarten testified, "I have never known anybody like Dana and the respect that when one judges their own life's worth or life's value, nobody has come close to Dana. And the people that I have come in contact with and have been friends with, to where money has been the most important determining factor of one's value." After 5 months of trial and 11 days of deliberation, they were both found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and were eligible for the death penalty. Now, instead, they were both given life without the possibility of parole, and Dana was placed in the protective house unit of the California State Prison to isolate him from the general population of the prison, which included Charles Manson. Joel was placed in the Mule Creek State Prison, and Dana said, after being sentenced, "I loved my family with all my heart and soul. We were so very close and happy and content. I only wish that I could get up and walk away from here and that my mother, my father, and my sister would be waiting for me and we would be together again forever." Now, most of the jurors in this trial were said to be parents who really wanted to believe that these young boys couldn't be killers, and so they went in believing that they were truly innocent. Yet, after all of the evidence, it was very hard to keep that narrative. And one of the jurors even came forward to say that Dana scared people, that he would look at them in the courtroom and that his face would change and he would believe that he had almost horns that were about to come out of his head. Although on the other side, they said Joel appeared to be this broken person who wasn't a natural-born killer, but he was the one who shot them. They all said that they trusted Ernest the least and that they were angry he wasn't being tried for murder. Jurors said that he testified in too much detail and would talk about how the murders occurred in first person before correcting himself, and they believed that Ernest had actually been in the house when the murders occurred. Rumors were also brought up that the time that Dana's grandfather had passed away in that basement explosion, Joel had been in Ohio, where he lived. But Dana's uncle hopes to forget that Dana even exists, and Ernest Ponce is now said to be an attorney in Orange County. Peter Radovich, he owns his own company as well in LA. And Dana's girlfriend Monica, who had a killer pay for her college tuition of law school, now owns her own firm called Zent Law Group. The Ewell fortune was completely stripped from Dana. He didn't get any, everything was given to other members of the family, which is great irony because he didn't want to share the $8 million with his sister or wait for his parents to pass. Instead, he killed them for everything and got nothing. All appeals for Dana and Joel have been denied, and Dana claims that he found religion in prison, and he is also a part of a prison pen pal group where his profile says, a finance graduate from Santa Clara University. I was beginning my career in investment banking when some extraordinarily painful events turned my world upside down. Do you believe that Joel was manipulated into becoming a killer? Was money the pure motive here? How did Dana turn into such a greedy, uncaring human when his parents were the opposite and were the least greedy people? Or were they? Do you believe that even though they lived a very, very humble lifestyle, they were still money obsessed? Was he born this way, or was it the fact that he was given everything he wanted that he felt like he was entitled to the rest of the money? Should Ernest Ponce and Peter have been charged, as well as Monica, for not coming forward with what they knew about all of this? I don't think we will ever know exactly why the only way Dana believed he could move forward with his life was to hire his friend to kill his family. I'm not sure there will ever be an explanation for that. And I think for the Ewell family, that's heartbreaking. But I think what his uncle was saying about just not wanting to even remember Dana exists at all is probably the best for them. Don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.